In the matter of Miller versus Miller, docket number 14932. I never thought I'd hear my own last name used against me in court. On one side of the room, my son, his wife, and their expensive lawyer telling the judge I was too old and confused to manage a single dollar. On the other side, me, 72 years old, in my best jacket, sitting quietly while they tried to grab my house, my savings, and my late husband's car in one move. Their lawyer spoke like this was a formality, like we were all just going through the motions. We're only here to protect her, Your Honor. My clients are requesting control over all of her property to ensure Mrs. Miller doesn't hurt herself financially. The judge nodded to the bailiff. Read her inventory into the record. The bailiff opened my file and began in a steady voice. Item 1. Primary residence at 118 Maple Ridge. Owned free and clear. Market value? $385,000. My son smiled. He'd always assumed there was still a mortgage. Item 2. Personal savings and certificates of deposit. Combined balance, $423,000. His wife squeezed his arm, that greedy little smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The bailiff turned the page. Item 3. The Miller Family Trust, holding 9 rental properties and 1 commercial building. Total appraised value, $3,170,000. Beneficiaries include 3 minor grandchildren, the Tampa Community Scholarship Fund, and 2 longtime employees of Miller Auto. He paused, and the next words came out clear as a bell. Petitioners Brian and Kelsey Miller are expressly removed as heirs in any circumstance involving alleged elder financial abuse or contested guardianship. The judge's head snapped up. My son shot to his feet, his chair slamming back. Removed as heirs? You put strangers over your own son? How could you hide this from us? Mr. Miller, the judge warned. But Brian wasn't done. You're sitting on $3 million and you let us struggle. And now you're doing this to punish us. Stop immediately, the judge barked. Get security in here now. 2 officers stepped through the side door. My son and his wife froze in their seats. They thought this hearing would be the day they took everything from me. They had no idea I'd spent months making sure this would be the day I took my life back. I'm telling you this story because I wish someone had told me theirs. I wish I'd known that what happened to me happens to women my age every single day. So, wherever you are right now, whether you're in New York or London or somewhere I've never heard of, drop a comment and let me know. Tell me what time it is where you are. And if any part of this sounds familiar, if you've ever had to stand up to family who underestimated you, hit that like button and share this. Subscribe, because I promise you, I'm not the only woman who's had to fight for what's hers. Now let me take you back to where this really started. Sitting in that Tampa courtroom with security guards standing between me and my only child, I felt my heart pounding. Not from fear. From something else entirely. It was the strange heavy relief of a battle I'd been avoiding for months, finally coming out into the open. My attorney, Miss Roberts, sat beside me with her neat folders and calm expression. She'd warned me this might happen, that once Brian and his wife Kelsey realized what was actually in that trust, they wouldn't be able to hide what this was really about. The judge shuffled papers, the sound cutting through the thick silence. We will proceed, he said, his voice firm. And Mr. Miller, if you cannot control yourself, I will have you removed from these proceedings. Do you understand me? Brian muttered something that sounded like yes and sank back into his chair. His face was red, his jaw clenched. Kelsey's hand was white-knuckled on his arm. Their lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, probably trying to salvage whatever strategy they'd walked in with. That strategy had been simple. Convince the judge that a confused old woman needed her capable son to take over before she lost everything. What they didn't count on was that the confused old woman had been 3 steps ahead of them for months. I looked down at my hands, folded in my lap. These hands had balanced ledgers for 50 years. These hands had signed checks, negotiated with suppliers, paid employees, managed properties. These hands had built something with my husband, Hank. One careful decision at a time. You need to know about the moment I realized my own child saw me as nothing more than a bank account with a heartbeat. My name is Joan Miller. Until last year, I thought I knew exactly where I stood in my small corner of Tampa, Florida. I was wrong. The courtroom felt cold despite the Florida heat outside. The judge was reading through documents, his expression unreadable. Brian kept glancing at me, then looking away, like he couldn't quite meet my eyes but couldn't stop checking to see if I was going to break. I wasn't going to break. Ms. Roberts had spent weeks preparing me for this moment. Medical evaluations proving I was sharper than most 50-year-olds. Financial records showing decades of responsible management. Letters from neighbors, my pastor, my property manager, even my mail carrier, all saying the same thing. Joan Miller knows exactly what she's doing, but none of that mattered as much as the document the bailiff had just read into the record. The trust, the protection I'd put in place after I overheard what my son and his wife were planning. The judge finally looked up. "Mrs. Miller," he said, and my stomach tightened. "I've reviewed the preliminary materials, but I want to understand something." Here it comes, I thought. Why did you structure your estate this way? Why remove your own son as a beneficiary? The courtroom went silent. Even the bailiff seemed to hold his breath. I took a slow breath, feeling Ms. Roberts' steadying presence beside me. This was the question I'd been practicing for. The one I needed to answer carefully, honestly, without letting 50 years of being a mother get in the way of 50 years of being a woman who knew her own mind. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady despite the trembling in my chest. "To answer that, I need to tell you about my husband, about our business, about the choices we made when nobody was watching." The judge nodded. "Go ahead." And so, with my son sitting 20 feet away, with security guards stationed between us, with everything I'd worked for hanging in the balance, I began to tell the story of how I'd gotten here. But right now, in this moment, all I could think about was what would happen next. Would the judge believe me? Would he see through Brian's concerned son act to the desperate, entitled man underneath? Would he understand that sometimes protecting yourself from your own family isn't cruelty, it's survival? My husband and I met at a church picnic in 1972. I was 23, fresh out of a community college business program, working as a bookkeeper for a printing company. Hank was 25, covered in grease from fixing someone's truck in the parking lot, grinning like he'd just solved the world's biggest puzzle. "You any good with numbers?" he asked me, wiping his hands on a rag that was probably dirtier than his hands. "Better than most," I said. "Good, I'm terrible with them." He held out his hand. Hank Miller. That was it. That was how it started. We got married 8 months later in a little ceremony at that same church. No honeymoon, no fancy anything. Hank had just signed a lease on a garage bay in a rundown part of Tampa, and we were pouring every dollar into making Miller Auto a real business. In those early days, Hank worked on the cars and I worked on everything else. I sat in a corner office that was really just a desk shoved between filing cabinets and boxes of parts, doing the books by hand. Payroll, invoices, tax forms. I tracked every penny that came in and every penny that went out. Hank trusted me completely. "You tell me we can afford it, he'd say. "You tell me we can't. Simple as that. I loved that about him. No second guessing, no mansplaining how money worked. He knew his engines, and he knew I knew my ledgers. The shop grew slowly. Word got around that Hank Miller was honest and did good work. People started coming from all over the county. We hired our first employee, a kid named Danny, who was great with transmissions. Then another guy, Ray, who could diagnose anything just by listening to it run. By the time we'd been married 5 years, the business was solid. Not making us rich, but steady. Reliable. We bought the building our shop was in, so we wouldn't have to worry about rent increases. That was my idea. Hank had wanted to buy a nicer truck, but I showed him the numbers. "This building will still be here in 20 years, I told him. "That truck will be in a junkyard." He laughed and signed the papers. Around that same time, a rental house came up for sale, 3 blocks from our own little place. It was a mess, needed work, but the bones were good. Hank looked at me over dinner one night. "What do you think?" I'd already run the numbers. If we can get them down to 82,000, we can swing it. But we'll be tight for a year. We got it for 80,000. Hank and Danny spent weekends fixing it up. New roof, fresh paint, updated plumbing. 6 months later, we had a tenant paying rent every month like clockwork. That first rental check felt like magic. Money coming in that wasn't tied to Hank being under a car. I deposited it and immediately started a separate account. This is for the next one, I told Hank. The next what? He asked. The next house. He just shook his head, smiling. You're something else, Joni. We bought another rental 2 years later, then another 3 years after that. Each time, we'd save, wait for the right property, buy it, fix it up, and rent it out. Nothing fancy, just solid brick homes in working neighborhoods where people needed a decent place to raise their kids. Our friends at church thought we were just scraping by. They saw the same dented truck Hank drove for 15 years. They saw our little house with the sagging porch and the lawn that needed mowing. They didn't see the file cabinet in my home office with the deeds, the rental agreements, the growing stack of mortgage payoff letters. We lived quietly. We didn't need to show off. Hank liked his old guitars and his fishing trips with Ray. I liked balance sheets that added up and knowing we were building something that would last. We only had one child. Brian came along when I was 30, after we'd been trying for years. The doctors had said it might not happen, so when it did, we were over the moon. Brian was a sweet baby. Curious, always watching everything with those big eyes. When he was little, maybe 4 or 5, he'd run around the shop in tiny overalls Hank had bought him, asking a million questions about every tool, every car, every bolt. What's this do, Daddy? Why's that part move? Can I help? Hank would set him up with a bucket of clean rags and let him help wipe down parts. Brian would work so seriously, his little tongue poking out in concentration, just like his father. I thought, back then, that he'd grow up and take over the shop, that he'd learn the business from the ground up the way Hank had, and someday it would be Miller & Son Auto. But somewhere around middle school, things started to shift. Brian got friends whose parents were doctors and lawyers. He'd come home complaining that we didn't live in the right neighborhood, that his friends' houses had pools and game rooms and his didn't. He started asking why his dad worked on junky old cars instead of something nicer, something that paid better. Your father does honest work, I'd tell him. There's nothing wrong with that. But we could have more, Brian would say, frustration in his young voice. We could live somewhere better. What he didn't know, what we never told him, was that we could have lived somewhere better. We could have bought a bigger house in a fancier neighborhood. We could have gotten new cars and taken expensive vacations. We chose not to. Every extra dollar went into paying off those rentals. Every bonus, every good quarter, every tax refund got funneled into investments that would mean something down the road. Hank and I had grown up poor. We'd both watched our parents struggle in old age, scraping by on Social Security, dependent on their kids for help. We promised each other we'd never be a burden, that we'd build something solid enough to carry us through whatever came. By the time Brian graduated high school, we owned 4 rental properties outright. The shop was paid for. Our own house had been mortgage-free for 6 years. On paper, we were doing better than almost anyone we knew. But Brian saw the old truck and the small house and assumed we were just getting by. He wanted what he called a bigger life. Private university. A nicer car. A future that didn't smell like motor oil. And you know who paid for that bigger life? We did. When Brian got accepted to a private college 3 hours north, the scholarship he'd gotten covered maybe half. Hank refinanced our house to make up the difference. It's an investment in his future, he said, signing the papers. I remember sitting at our kitchen table, watching him sign, feeling something twist in my stomach. Not regret exactly, just a question I couldn't quite form into words. When Brian maxed out his credit cards in his 20s, buying things he couldn't afford to impress people who didn't matter, we wrote him a check. Just this once, Hank said. It wasn't just once. When Brian met Kelsey, she was sweet at first, polite. She'd help me in the kitchen after Sunday dinners, complimenting my cooking, asking about my day. I wanted to like her. I tried to like her. But she had expensive taste. Their wedding had to be at a waterfront hotel. The dress had to come from a specific boutique. The flowers had to be imported. It's her special day, Brian said, when I suggested maybe scaling back just a little. We paid for most of it. Hank smiled through the whole thing, dancing with me at the reception, whispering in my ear, "She makes him happy. That's what matters." The down payment on their house was the biggest check we ever wrote. $70,000, transferred from our savings account to theirs with a single click. I stared at the computer screen afterward, at the new balance that was so much smaller than it had been 5 minutes before. Hank put his hand on my shoulder. "We've still got the rentals," he said quietly. "We'll be fine." And we were fine. The rental income kept coming. The shop kept running. We adjusted, but something had shifted. I noticed it in the way Brian talked to us, or rather, the way he talked about money when he was around us. Always some new emergency, always some unexpected expense, always needing just a little help to get through. And we always helped. Looking back now, I can see what we were teaching him. We were teaching him that we'd always be there to catch him when he fell. That no matter how much he spent or how badly he managed his finances, Mom and Dad would fix it. We meant well. We wanted to give him chances we never had. We wanted to smooth out the rough patches so he could build something good. What we didn't realize was that we were teaching him something else too, something neither of us intended. We were teaching him that our money was his safety net, that it existed for him, to solve his problems, to fund his dreams. We were teaching him to see us as a resource instead of as people. I didn't understand that yet, not fully, not until much later, after Hank was gone and I was standing alone in a quiet house, finally seeing the pattern for what it was. But that comes later in the story. For now, in those years when Brian was young and Hank was alive and the shop was humming along, I still believed we were doing the right thing. I believed that loving your child meant sacrificing for them, helping them, giving them every advantage you could manage. I believed that family meant always saying yes. I didn't know yet that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is learn to say no. The shift happened gradually, the way a season changes without you noticing, until one day you realize the leaves are gone and winter is here. Brian's first year of high school, he came home upset because a kid in his class had made fun of his lunch. I'd packed him the same thing I always did, a sandwich and some fruit, nothing fancy. But apparently this boy, whose father owned a chain of car dealerships, had looked at Brian's brown paper bag and laughed. "Why can't you pack lunch in something normal?" Brian asked me that night. "Everyone else has those insulated bags with the logos." I bought him one the next day. It seemed like such a small thing. But it wasn't small. It was the first crack in something I hadn't realized needed protecting. By his junior year, Brian had a whole new group of friends. Kids whose parents drove luxury cars to pick them up from school. Kids who went on ski trips over winter break and spent summers at beach houses. He'd come home and his complaints got bigger. "Why do we live in this neighborhood?" he asked one night at dinner. "The Harrisons live in Bayshore. They have a pool." Hank looked up from his plate. "We live here because it's paid for, and it's home." "It's embarrassing," Brian muttered. I felt that like a slap. Embarrassing. This house where we'd raised him, where Hank had built him a treehouse in the backyard, where I'd nursed him through every childhood fever. Embarrassing. "Brian," I said carefully, "we've made choices about how to spend our money. That doesn't mean you don't have it." "Then why don't we spend it?" he shot back. "Why does Dad still work on beat-up trucks instead of something nice? Why do we drive that old piece of junk?" Hank set down his fork. "That old piece of junk runs perfectly fine. And those beat-up trucks pay for your school, your clothes, and the roof over your head." Brian pushed back from the table and left. I should have had a longer conversation with him that night. I should have explained what we were building, why we lived the way we did. But I didn't. I told myself he was just a teenager, that he'd understand when he was older. I was making excuses for him even then. When the college acceptance letters came, Brian had his heart set on a private university up north. Good school, great reputation, Absolutely terrible price tag. His scholarship covered about half. Financial aid helped some, but there was still a gap, a big one. We sat down with him and went through the numbers. State school would be fully covered, I said. You'd graduate with no debt. But I got into Garrison, he said, and there was something in his voice I'd never heard before. Not just wanting, needing. Like his entire worth as a person depended on going to this particular school. All my friends are going to good schools. I can't tell them I'm going to state. Hank and I talked about it that night, in bed, in the dark where the hard conversations always seem to happen. We could refinance the house, Hank said quietly. Rates are decent right now. We could pull out enough to cover all 4 years. My stomach dropped. Hank, we just paid that mortgage off 3 years ago. I know. He was quiet for a moment. But he's our son. We can't let money stand between him and his future. That's the thing about being a parent. Someone puts it to you like that, like you're choosing between money and your child's dreams, and suddenly there's only one choice you can make without feeling like a monster. We refinanced. Hank was 52, and we took on a mortgage that wouldn't be paid off until he was 67. It's fine, he kept saying. The shop's doing well. The rentals are solid. We'll manage. We did manage. But I noticed every month when I wrote that mortgage check, money going out that used to stay in. Money that could have been going toward another property, toward building the cushion we'd always planned for old age. Brian loved Garrison. He loved everything about it. He'd call home and tell us about his classes, his professors, the networking events where he met people who knew people. He sounded happy. During his sophomore year, Hank had his first heart attack. It was mild, the doctor said. A warning shot. He needed to slow down, watch his stress, take medication. He was back at the shop within 2 weeks, against doctor's orders, because we had customers waiting and bills to pay and now a mortgage again. I begged him to hire someone to help more. We can afford it, I said. We need to afford Brian's last 2 years, he countered. So he kept working, and I kept writing checks. And Brian kept calling with stories about his amazing college experience. After graduation, Brian moved back to Tampa and got a job at a marketing firm. Good salary for a first job, enough to live on if you were careful. But Brian had gotten used to a certain lifestyle at Garrison. He rented an apartment in a nice complex, bought a car that was way too expensive for someone just starting out, went out with his college friends when they came to town. 6 months in, he called asking for help. I got behind on my credit cards, he said, and I could hear the shame in his voice. Just a few thousand. I'll pay you back as soon as I get my year-end bonus. A few thousand turned out to be almost $12,000, spread across 4 different cards. Hank wrote the check without blinking. Just this once, Hank told him firmly. You cut up those cards and you learn to live within your means. I will, Dad. I promise. He didn't. 2 years later, it happened again. Different excuse, same problem. This time it was medical bills from an emergency room visit that his insurance only partially covered, plus some unexpected car repairs, plus he'd gotten behind on rent, helping out a friend who was in trouble. The number was bigger, the explanations were longer. And once again, we paid it. This is the last time, I said when I handed him the check. Brian hugged me. I know, Mom. I've learned my lesson. I really have. I wanted to believe him. That's the thing about loving someone. You want to believe them, even when the pattern says you shouldn't. That's when Kelsey came into the picture. Brian brought her to Sunday dinner about 8 months after his second bailout. She was pretty, well-dressed, polite. She worked in retail management at a boutique clothing store and talked about moving up to regional management someday. It's so nice to finally meet you, she said, helping me clear plates after dinner. Brian talks about you all the time. He says you're the smartest person he knows when it comes to money. I should have caught that, the way she brought up money in the first conversation, but I was too busy being pleased that my son had found someone who seemed sweet and grounded. They dated for a year before getting engaged. The ring Brian bought her was huge, way bigger than anything I would have chosen, and I knew without asking that he'd financed it. The wedding planning started immediately. Kelsey had very specific ideas about what she wanted. Waterfront venue, imported flowers, a dress from a boutique in New York that cost more than my first car. It's her special day, Brian said when I gently suggested maybe choosing something a little less expensive. She's only going to get married once. The total bill for that wedding could have bought another rental property. Hank and I covered most of it. Their families helped some, but the bulk fell on us. I remember standing at that wedding, watching Brian and Kelsey dance, and feeling this strange hollowness in my chest. The venue was beautiful. Everything was perfect. But I kept thinking about the number in our savings account, watching it shrink with every choice we made to keep Brian happy. "You okay?" Hank asked, pulling me close for a dance. "Just thinking about money," I admitted. He kissed my forehead. "We've still got the rentals. We're fine, Joni." That became his mantra. We're fine. And we were, technically. The rental income kept coming. The shop still made money. We weren't struggling, but we also weren't building anymore. Every dollar that used to go toward the future was now going toward Brian's present. When Brian and Kelsey started house hunting, I knew what was coming before he even asked. They wanted something in a good school district, even though they didn't have kids yet. Something with space to grow. Something that would impress Kelsey's parents when they visited. The down payment they needed was $70,000. $70,000. I sat at my computer, my finger hovering over the mouse, about to authorize the transfer. Hank stood behind me, his hand on my shoulder. "You sure about this?" I asked him. "He's our son," Hank said simply. "What else are we gonna do with it?" I clicked transfer and watched the money disappear from our account into theirs. Brian called 30 minutes later, ecstatic. "Mom, it went through. We got the house. Thank you so much. We'll pay you back, I promise." "You don't have to pay us back," I said, "because that's what you say when you're a parent. Just build a good life." After I hung up, I sat there staring at our bank balance. Still healthy, but nothing like what it had been. All those years of careful saving, careful investing, careful planning, gone in a few clicks to fund a life my son wanted but couldn't actually afford. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept running the numbers in my head. Every check we'd written, every bailout, every gift. Adding it up in the dark, while Hank snored softly beside me. And I realized something that made my chest tight. We hadn't been helping Brian build a life. We'd been teaching him that he didn't have to, that no matter what choices he made, no matter how he mismanaged his money, we'd be there to fix it. We'd taught him to see our savings as his safety net. And now, lying in the dark at 68 years old, with a mortgage we'd taken on to fund his education and a savings account we'd drained to fund his lifestyle, I finally understood what we'd done. We'd taught him that our money belonged to him. We just didn't know he'd eventually decide to take it. Hank died on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I was at home going through receipts when my phone rang. It was Ray from the shop, and something in the way he said my name made my whole body go cold. "Joan, you need to come down here. It's Hank." "What happened? Is he hurt?" Ray's voice cracked. "Joan, just come, please." I drove faster than I should have, my hands shaking on the wheel. When I got to the shop, there was an ambulance in the parking lot, lights still flashing but silent. That silence told me everything. They let me see him. He was lying on the concrete floor next to a cherry red Mustang he'd been restoring for 6 months, his favorite project. There was a rag still in his hand, grease on his fingers. His eyes were open, staring up at the ceiling like he was trying to figure out one last problem. The paramedics said it was massive, that he probably didn't feel much, that it was quick. They said it like that was supposed to comfort me. He was 69 years old. We were supposed to have more time. The funeral was on a Saturday. The church was packed. Customers whose cars Hank had fixed over the years, guys he'd mentored, neighbors, friends from 40 years of living in the same small corner of Tampa. Person after person stood up and talked about what a good man he was, how honest, how hardworking. Hank Miller never cheated anybody, one old customer said. He'd tell you straight if something needed fixing, or if it could wait. You don't find that much anymore. Brian gave a eulogy that was beautiful and sad, and made me cry. He talked about learning to change oil with his dad. About the treehouse Hank built him, about what a good father he'd been. I sat there listening and thought, yes, that's who Hank was. That's exactly who he was. What I didn't think about, what I couldn't let myself think about yet, was who I was going to be without him. The first week after the funeral was a blur of casseroles from neighbors and phone calls from the insurance company. The second week, people stopped coming by as much. The third week, the house got very quiet. I'd wake up and reach for Hank's side of the bed and find it empty. I'd make coffee for two before remembering it was just me now. I'd walk past the garage and see his tools hanging on the pegboard, waiting for hands that would never pick them up again. People told me grief takes time. They were right, but they didn't tell me how long the days would feel, how many hours there are between sunrise and sunset when you're alone with your thoughts and your empty house. I had paperwork to deal with. So much paperwork. Death certificates, insurance claims, the business to sort out. Danny and Ray wanted to buy Miller Auto, and after talking to my accountant, I agreed to sell it to them. Hank would have liked that, knowing the shop would stay in good hands. The sale went through about 6 weeks after Hank died. It wasn't a fortune, but it was fair. I deposited the check and sat in my car in the bank parking lot, crying for reasons I couldn't quite name. That's when Brian started coming around more often. At first, I was grateful. He'd stop by after work, help me with things around the house, make sure I was eating. It felt like having my son back, the sweet boy who used to help his dad in the garage. But about 2 months after the funeral, something shifted. Brian showed up on a Sunday afternoon with a stack of glossy brochures. He spread them out on my kitchen table while I made coffee. "Mom, Kelsey and I have been talking," he said, using that gentle voice people use when they think you're fragile. "We're worried about you rattling around in this old house all alone." I set his coffee down and looked at the brochures. Sunset Gardens Senior Living, Tampa Bay Retirement Community, Whispering Pines Assisted Care. "These are really nice places," Brian continued. "They have activities, meal plans, emergency call buttons. You have people around. You wouldn't have to worry about maintenance or yard work or anything." I picked up one of the brochures. The people in the photos all looked happy, playing cards and doing crafts. They also all looked about 20 years older than me. "Brian, I'm 72, not 92. I don't need assisted living." "Not now," he said quickly, "but you should start thinking about it. This house is getting old. Things are going to need fixing. The yard's too much for you to handle. I've been handling this house and yard for 45 years. But you had Dad then." He reached across the table and put his hand over mine. "It's different now. You're alone. What if something happens? What if you fall and there's nobody here?" I pulled my hand back gently. "I have neighbors. I have a phone. I'm fine, Brian." He sat back, and I saw something flicker across his face. Not quite frustration, but close. "Okay," he said slowly, "but you should at least think about it. And Mom, we need to talk about your finances." "My finances?" "The shop sale, your accounts, the house. You're managing a lot by yourself now. Kelsey and I talked about it, and we think it might be easier if you let us help. We could handle the bills for you, manage the money so you don't have to stress about it." I set my coffee cup down carefully. "Brian, I've paid our bills for 50 years. I think I can handle a light bill." "I know you can," he said, but his tone suggested otherwise. "But you're grieving. You're not thinking clearly. This is a lot of responsibility and you shouldn't have to carry it alone." There it was. "You're not thinking clearly." "I'm sad," I said firmly. "That doesn't mean I'm incompetent." He held up his hands. "I didn't say incompetent. I said we want to help. That's what family does, Mom. We help each other." After he left, I sat at that kitchen table for a long time, looking at those brochures. Part of me wondered if he was right. Maybe I was being stubborn. Maybe it would be easier to let someone else handle things. But a bigger part of me, the part that had balanced books and negotiated with bankers and built a portfolio from nothing, knew exactly what I was doing. And I didn't like the assumption that grief had somehow erased 50 years of competence. The phone calls started after that. Brian would call every few days, always with some version of the same conversation. "Did you remember to pay your property tax, Mom? You sounded confused when I asked last time." The banker called me back. "Rates are really complicated right now. You could make a mistake if you're not careful. If something happened to you, the courts would tie everything up for months. It's better if we just handle it now, while you can still sign things." Kelsey would chime in on speakerphone, her voice sweet, but somehow sharp underneath. "We're just worried about you, Mom. There are so many scams targeting older people these days. You need someone looking out for you." The funny thing was, the only people calling me confused were the ones asking about my bank accounts. I started noticing a pattern. Every conversation eventually circled back to money. How much did I have? Where was it? Who had access? What were my plans? They never asked how I was sleeping, or if I was lonely, or if I wanted company for dinner. Just money. One evening in late May, Brian called while I was making myself a sandwich. "Hey Mom, I was thinking about the house. Have you considered what it's worth now? The market's really good. You could sell and have a nice chunk of money for retirement." "I am retired, and this is my home." "I know, but think about it. You sell the house, move into one of those communities, and you'd have all that equity freed up. We could help you invest it properly." "Brian, I know how to invest money." "Sure, but things change. You need to stay current. Look, why don't you add my name to your accounts, just in case something happens? That way, if you forget a payment or something, I can jump in and help." My hand tightened on the phone. "I'm not forgetting any payments. Not yet, but Dad just died. You're under a lot of stress. It could happen." After I hung up, I sat very still in my quiet kitchen. The sandwich I'd been making sat forgotten on the counter. Something had changed in the way Brian talked to me. It wasn't the loving concern of a son checking on his mother. It was something else. It was impatience. Like I was an obstacle between him and something he wanted. Over the next few weeks, the calls kept coming. The suggestions got more insistent. Sell the house, move somewhere smaller, let them manage the money, sign this, authorize that. Always framed as concern, always wrapped in love. But underneath, I heard something new. Something that made my stomach tighten every time the phone rang. I heard someone who thought my money was his to manage. And I heard someone who was running out of patience waiting for me to hand it over. The call came on a Thursday evening in June, about 3 months after Hank died. I was sitting in the living room working on a crossword puzzle, something I'd taken up to keep my mind busy during the long, quiet evenings. The phone rang and I picked it up. "Hello?" Nothing. Just background noise. Voices talking, but not to me. I was about to hang up when I heard Kelsey's voice, clear as day. "I'm telling you, once we get everything in our name, we can finally breathe. The house alone is worth almost $400,000. Then there's whatever she's got in savings, and that old Chevy in the garage. Brian, your dad's car could sell for serious money." My hand froze on the phone. "Keep your voice down," Brian said, but he sounded more annoyed than concerned. "She could be on the line. She doesn't even know how to check her voicemail," Kelsey said with a little laugh. "She's probably sitting in that house right now wondering why we called." I should have hung up. I should have slammed the phone down and pretended I'd never heard it. But I couldn't move. I just sat there, listening to my son and his wife plan how to take everything I owned. "We need to push harder," Kelsey continued. "Get her to sign the power of attorney. Once we have that, we can start liquidating. Sell the house, move her into some cheap place, and use the rest to pay off our debts." "What about the shop money?" Brian asked. "That too, all of it. She doesn't need it. What's a 72-year-old woman going to do with $400,000 in the bank? She'll just sit on it until she dies, and then the government takes half in taxes." "The boutique is hemorrhaging money," Brian said quietly. "If we don't get a cash infusion soon, we're going to lose everything." "Then, make it happen," Kelsey said. "She's your mother. Cry if you have to. Tell her you're worried about her being alone. Whatever works, just get her to sign." I took a slow breath and said, very quietly, "Hello." The silence that followed was so thick I could feel it through the phone line. "Mom?" Brian's voice jumped 3 octaves. "Are you there?" "I'm here." More silence. I could almost hear him scrambling, trying to figure out what I'd heard, how much damage had been done. I thought the call went to voicemail, he said finally. We were talking about estate planning. General stuff. You know how Kelsey worries. Estate planning, I repeated. Yeah, just making sure you have everything in order. In case something happens, it's responsible, really. I see. Look, Mom, you might have heard things out of context. We're just concerned about you. With Dad gone, you're vulnerable. We want to make sure you're protected. Protected. That was the word he chose. I need to go, I said. Mom, wait, let me explain. I hung up. Then I sat there in my living room, the crossword puzzle forgotten in my lap, staring at the wall where Hank's favorite photo hung. It was from our 30th anniversary, both of us grinning at the camera, his arm around my shoulders. My hands started shaking. Not from fear. From something deeper, something that started in my chest and spread through my whole body like ice water. They wanted my house, my savings, the car Hank had restored with his own hands, the car he'd planned to drive in his retirement, the car that still smelled like him when I sat in the driver's seat. They wanted everything, and they thought I was too old and too stupid to stop them. I got up and walked through the house, seeing it differently now. Every room held something we'd built, or bought, or fixed together. The kitchen table where we'd eaten breakfast for 45 years. The bedroom where we'd slept side by side, where I still couldn't bring myself to move his reading glasses from the nightstand. The garage where his tools hung exactly where he'd left them. This wasn't just a house worth $400,000. This was my life, my history, my home, and my son saw it as an asset to liquidate. I thought about every check we'd written for Brian. College, credit cards, wedding, house down payment. Probably close to $200,000 over the years, maybe more. Not gifts, I realize now. Investments. He'd been investing in the idea that we owed him. That our money was his inheritance, and he was just waiting for the right moment to collect. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind cycling through memory after memory. Brian at 6, bringing me dandelions from the yard, like they were roses. Brian at 16, embarrassed to be seen with us at the grocery store. Brian at 25, asking for another loan with tears in his eyes. Brian at 38, on the phone with his wife, talking about liquidating my house. Where had I lost him? When had the shift happened from son to stranger? Or had I just been too blind to see it until now? Around 3 a.m, lying there in the dark, I heard a voice in my head. It wasn't Hank's voice, though I wished it was. It was my own voice. Quiet but firm. No more. 2 words, that's all. But they felt like a door closing and another one opening. No more pretending this was normal concern. No more making excuses for behavior that got worse every time I enabled it. No more sacrificing what Hank and I built so Brian could fix problems he kept creating. No more. I got up as the sun was starting to rise and went to the kitchen. There was an old file box on the top shelf of the pantry, the one where I kept important documents, deeds, mortgage papers, insurance policies, the trust documents Hank and I had set up years ago. I pulled it down and set it on the kitchen table. For 50 years, I'd managed money. I'd balanced books, made investments, handled negotiations. I'd built something real from nothing, one careful decision at a time. I wasn't confused. I wasn't incompetent. I wasn't too old to know what was happening. I was a woman who'd just heard her son plan to rob her, and I was done being afraid to call it what it was. I opened the file box and started pulling out papers. There had to be something here, some protection Hank and I had put in place, some way to keep what we'd built from being stripped away by someone who saw me as an obstacle instead of a person. The morning light came through the kitchen window, falling across the papers spread out in front of me. Somewhere in this box was the answer. I just had to find it, and then I had to be brave enough to use it, because the son I'd raised was gone, and the man who'd taken his place was coming for everything I had. The only question now was whether I had the strength to stop him. I pulled the file box closer and kept looking. I had a doctor's appointment the following Tuesday. It was just a routine checkup, something Dr. David Dameron had scheduled before Hank died. Blood pressure, basic labs. The usual questions about how I was eating and sleeping. She'd added a grief check after Hank passed, asking gently how I was managing, if I was getting out of the house, if I had people to talk to. I told her I was fine. People always said they were fine. The waiting room was quieter than usual that morning. I sat in one of those uncomfortable chairs they always have in medical offices, flipping through a magazine without really seeing the pages. My mind was still on that phone call, on Kelsey's voice saying liquidate, like my whole life was just a transaction waiting to happen. That's when I saw the pamphlet. It was in a rack on the wall, next to brochures about diabetes management and fall prevention. Bright yellow, impossible to miss. The title read, Protecting Yourself, a guide for older adults and their families. I almost didn't pick it up, but something made me reach for it, maybe just needing something to do with my hands while I waited. The first page had a simple question in bold letters. Do you feel pressured to sign financial documents you don't understand? I kept reading. Does a family member tell you that you're too old or confused to handle your own money? My chest tightened. Has someone suggested moving you out of your home for your own good, even though you're capable of living independently? I turned the page with shaking hands. The pamphlet laid it out in plain language. Financial exploitation, elder abuse. It described patterns I recognized immediately. Adult children who suddenly became very concerned about their aging parents' finances, pressure to sign power of attorney documents, suggestions about selling homes or moving into facilities, accusations of confusion or incompetence without any medical basis. And then, in a section that made my throat close up, it talked about guardianship petitions, how family members sometimes went to court claiming their parents couldn't manage their own affairs, seeking legal control over everything they owned. I read that section 3 times. The pamphlet listed warning signs, things to watch for, red flags that someone might be trying to take financial advantage of an older person. Every single one described something Brian or Kelsey had said or done in the past 3 months. There was a phone number at the bottom of the last page. Tampa Bay Legal Aid, Seniors' Rights Division, free consultations for adults over 65. I folded the pamphlet and put it in my purse, just as the nurse called my name. Dr. Dameron took my blood pressure twice because the first reading was too high. Everything okay, Joan? She asked, concerned. Your pressure's usually very stable. Just stressed, I said. About Brian? She asked gently. She'd known our family for years, had treated Brian when he was young. I hesitated. Then carefully I said, he's been very concerned about me since Hank died. Very focused on my finances. Something shifted in Dr. Dameron's expression. Concerned how? He thinks I should sell the house, move into a facility, let him manage my money. She set down her stethoscope and looked at me directly. Joan, do you have any trouble managing your finances? No. Do you forget to pay bills, get confused about your accounts? Never. Have you had any cognitive issues, memory problems, difficulty with daily tasks? None. She nodded slowly. Then why does Brian think you need help? That was the question, wasn't it? I don't know, I said quietly. But I heard him on the phone with his wife. They were talking about getting everything in their name. About liquidating my assets to pay their debts. Dr. Dameron's jaw tightened. Joan, I need you to listen to me. What you're describing sounds like attempted financial exploitation. It's more common than people think, especially with adult children who are under financial pressure themselves. He's my son, I said, and I hated how weak my voice sounded. I know, and I know that makes this harder. She pulled her chair closer. But you're one of the sharpest patients I have. Your cognition is excellent. Your ability to manage complex tasks is completely intact. If someone is suggesting otherwise, they're either misinformed or they have an agenda. After the appointment, I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time, holding that yellow pamphlet. Part of me felt ashamed. Ashamed that this was happening. Ashamed that I'd picked up a pamphlet about elder abuse like I was some helpless victim. Ashamed that I was even considering that my own son might be trying to exploit me. But another part of me felt something different. Relief. Relief that there was a name for what was happening. Relief that I wasn't crazy or paranoid. Relief that other people had been through this and survived it. Relief that I wasn't alone. I thought about Hank. If he were here, what would he say? I could almost hear his voice. Joni, you're the smartest person I know when it comes to money. You trust that brain of yours. He'd always trusted my judgment, never second-guessed me. Never suggested I was too old or too confused to handle things. He'd believed in me. And sitting there in that parking lot, holding a pamphlet about protecting myself from my own family, I realized I needed to believe in myself too. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number before I could talk myself out of it. A woman answered on the third ring. Tampa Bay Legal Aid, Seniors' Rights Division. My name is Joan Miller, I said. I think I need to talk to someone about protecting my assets. 3 days later, I sat in a small office downtown across from a woman named Amanda Roberts. She was probably in her 40s, wearing a professional suit with sharp eyes that didn't miss anything. Tell me what's happening, she said simply. So I did. I told her about Hank's death, about Brian's sudden concern for my finances, about the phone call I'd overheard. I told her about the pressure to sell the house, to sign documents, to let him manage everything. Miss Roberts took notes, her expression neutral but focused. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me directly. Mrs. Miller, I'm going to be very frank with you. You're in a strong position right now. You're cognitively intact, you have a long history of financial competence, and you haven't signed anything giving your son access or control. That's all good. She paused. But you're also at real risk. What you overheard suggests your son and his wife are planning to pursue guardianship. That's a legal process where they ask a court to declare you incapable of managing your own affairs. If they succeed, they get control of everything you own. My stomach dropped. Can they really do that? They can try, and sometimes they succeed, especially if the parent doesn't fight back. But here's what most people don't know. You can protect yourself before it ever gets to that point. She pulled out a legal pad and started sketching out options, trusts, updated estate documents, medical evaluations, financial records, ways to shore up my legal position before anyone could challenge it. Think of it like this, she said. Right now your son is testing the walls of your house, looking for weak spots. What we need to do is reinforce those walls before he starts kicking them down. I listened to her talk about revocable trusts, about explicit clauses that could protect assets from predatory guardianship attempts, about the importance of documenting my competence now, while I still controlled the narrative. This isn't about punishing your son, Ms. Roberts said carefully. This is about making sure you keep the right to make your own choices. That's all we're protecting here, your autonomy. I thought about that word, autonomy, my right to decide for myself. What do I need to do? I asked. Miss Roberts smiled for the first time. First, we document everything. Medical evaluation, financial records, character references. We build a paper trail showing you're completely capable. Then we update your trust to include protections against exactly what your son is planning. How long will that take? A few weeks if we move quickly. Can you avoid signing anything your son asks you to sign in the meantime? Yes, I said firmly. Good. And Mrs. Miller? Stop answering his calls about money. If he wants to discuss your finances, tell him to contact me. That's what lawyers are for. Walking out of that office, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. I felt like myself again. Not a grieving widow, not a confused old woman, not a problem to be managed. Just Joan Miller, 72 years old, sharp as ever, and done being pushed around. The neurological evaluation was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in late June. Miss Roberts had explained why it was necessary. If your son tries to claim you're incompetent, we need ironclad proof that you're not. Medical documentation beats family opinion every time in court. So I found myself sitting in Dr. Alice Butler's office, a neurologist Miss Roberts recommended, going through test after test. Memory recall, pattern recognition, problem solving, math calculations, following multi-step instructions. Some of it felt silly, like being back in school. I'm going to show you a list of words, Dr. Butler said. Try to remember as many as you can. Apple, table, courage, 7, river. She asked me other questions. Drew a clock showing 3:15. Counted backward from 100 by sevens. Named as many animals as I could in 60 seconds. After an hour of testing, she set down her clipboard and smiled. Mrs. Miller, I'm going to be blunt with you. You're sharper than half my 50-year-old patients. Your memory is excellent. Your executive function is completely intact. Your processing speed is well above average for your age group. So I'm not confused, I said. Not even remotely. She leaned forward. Miss Roberts told me why you're here. I see this more often than you'd think. Family members claim cognitive decline when what they really mean is the older person won't do what they want. She signed her evaluation report with a firm hand. If anyone questions your capacity, you show them this. I walked out of that appointment feeling validated in a way I hadn't realized I needed. For months, Brian had been planting seeds of doubt. Too old, too confused, can't manage. Hearing a medical professional say definitively that I was fine felt like permission to trust myself again. The work with Miss Roberts moved quickly after that. We met in her office twice a week, going through every aspect of my financial life. She reviewed the old trust documents Hank and I had created years ago, the ones that were standard and basic and didn't account for what was happening now. These are fine for normal circumstances, she said, but we need something stronger, something that protects you specifically from predatory guardianship attempts. She explained how we'd restructure everything. The Miller Family Trust would hold all the rental properties and the small commercial building on Fowler Avenue. My house would stay in my name, but with specific instructions about what would happen if I ever truly needed care. Here's the important part, Ms. Roberts said, pointing to a clause she'd drafted. Anyone who files for guardianship or conservatorship without legitimate medical cause automatically forfeits any inheritance, no exceptions. I stared at the words on the page. They seemed so harsh, so final. This feels like I'm punishing him, I said quietly. Miss Roberts set down her pen and looked at me. Mrs. Miller, let me reframe this for you. Right now, your son is planning to take you to court and claim you can't handle your own life. He wants a judge to strip you of your autonomy, your home, your money, everything. And he's doing it not because you need help, but because he needs cash. She tapped the document. This isn't punishment, this is consequence. You're simply saying that if someone tries to exploit you through the legal system, they don't also get to profit from your estate. That's not cruel, that's fair. I thought about that for a long time. Fair versus cruel, protection versus punishment. What about my grandchildren? I asked. They're still so young, I don't want them caught in the middle of this. They're protected, Miss Roberts assured me. The trust names them as beneficiaries regardless of what their parents do. They'll have money for college. Brian's actions won't change that. That helped. Knowing the kids would be okay, that I wasn't hurting them to protect myself. Over the next 2 weeks, we built layers of protection. I assigned power of attorney carefully, not to Brian, but to my niece in Atlanta, who'd always been responsible and had no financial stake in my assets. I set up automatic payments for all my regular bills, so there'd be no missed payments that could be used as evidence of decline. I organized every financial record I had, creating a paper trail that showed decades of competent management. Miss Roberts also hired a private investigator, something I hadn't expected. I need to know what we're up against, she explained. If your son is as financially desperate as you think, there will be records. And if we end up in court, I want to know his motivation before he tries to hide it. The investigator's report came back 10 days later. Miss Roberts walked me through it in her office, her expression serious. Brian and Kelsey had a second mortgage on their house. 2 leased luxury vehicles with payments they could barely afford. The boutique Kelsey had opened was failing, hemorrhaging money every month. Credit card debt over $60,000, spread across multiple cards. They're drowning. Miss Roberts said simply, and you look like a life raft. Seeing it all laid out in black and white made something shift in my chest. I'd known Brian struggled with money, but this was worse than I'd imagined. This was desperation. And desperate people did desperate things. Does this mean he'll definitely file for guardianship? I asked. I think it's very likely, Ms. Roberts said. Especially since you've stopped taking his calls about money. He knows something's changed. He'll probably escalate. She was right. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with all the documents spread out in front of me. The trust, the power of attorney, the medical evaluation, character letters from my pastor, my property manager, my neighbor Loretta, who'd known me for 30 years. Every piece of paper, was a brick in the wall I was building between myself and my son. I thought about little Brian in his tiny overalls, running around the shop asking questions. I thought about teenage Brian, embarrassed by us, but still coming to family dinners. I thought about adult Brian, always needing help, always struggling, always asking for one more chance. I'd loved all those versions of him. But the man on the other end of that phone call, the one talking about liquidating my house like it was just an asset on a spreadsheet, I didn't know him at all. And that grief, the grief of losing my son not to death, but to greed, sat heavy in my chest in a way that was almost worse than losing Hank. At least when Hank died, I had good memories. I had 50 years of love and partnership and building something together. With Brian, I had to look back at every moment and wonder if I'd missed the signs. If I'd created this by helping too much, by teaching him that our money existed to solve his problems. I didn't have answers to those questions. Maybe I never would. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't let guilt or grief or the ghost of who Brian used to be stop me from protecting what Hank and I built. The appointment to sign the updated trust was set for the following Monday. Miss Roberts walked me through every page, every clause, making sure I understood exactly what I was signing. This protects your assets, she said. It protects your autonomy. And it sends a very clear message that you're not an easy target. I signed my name on the last page, my hand steady. Walking out of her office that day, I felt the weight of what I'd done. I'd legally protected myself from my own child. I built walls between us that were designed to keep him out. It felt necessary. It felt responsible. And it broke my heart. It was a Thursday morning in early July when my doorbell rang. I'd just made coffee, standing at the kitchen counter in my robe, watching birds at the feeder Hank had built years ago. The morning routine had become my anchor. Coffee, toast, crossword puzzle. Simple things that reminded me life was still normal, still mine. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. I wasn't expecting anyone. Loretta usually called before coming over. The mail didn't come until afternoon. I tightened my robe and went to the door. A man in a polo shirt and khakis stood on my porch holding a manila envelope. He looked uncomfortable, the way people do when they have to do something unpleasant. "Joan Miller?" he asked. "Yes." "You've been served." He handed me the envelope and walked away before I could ask what it was. I stood there holding it, watching him get into a car parked at the curb and drive off. The envelope was thick, official-looking. My name and address were typed on the front. I carried it inside to the kitchen table and sat down. My coffee was getting cold. I stared at the envelope for a long moment before opening it. The first page had a case number and a lot of legal language I had to read twice to understand. But the key words jumped out clear enough. Petition for guardianship of an incapacitated adult. Petitioners, Brian Miller and Kelsey Miller. Respondent, Joan Miller. My hands started shaking. I turned the page and started reading the allegations. Each one was like a punch to the stomach. Respondent exhibits confusion and memory loss inconsistent with independent living. That was a lie. I'd never been confused. I had test results proving it. Respondent has missed multiple medical appointments and failed to take prescribed medications. Another lie. I hadn't missed a single appointment. I took my blood pressure medication every morning with breakfast. Respondent demonstrates unsafe driving habits and poor judgment. I'd been driving for 54 years without an accident. My insurance rates were lower than Brian's. Respondent has become increasingly isolated and refuses family assistance. Isolated. Because I'd stopped answering calls from people who wanted to liquidate my house. Respondent is unable to manage financial affairs and is at risk of exploitation by strangers. The irony of that line was so thick I almost laughed. The only people trying to exploit me were the ones who'd written this petition. I kept reading. Page after page of lies, dressed up in legal language. They made me sound like a woman who couldn't remember her own name, who left the stove on, who wandered around confused and helpless. They made me sound like someone who needed to be rescued from herself. And the remedy they were asking for was complete control. Control of my finances, control of my living situation, control of my medical decisions, control of everything. I sat there in my quiet kitchen, still in my robe, reading my own son's sworn statement that I was incompetent to live my own life. The betrayal of it hit me in waves. Not just that he was doing this, but that he was willing to lie, to put falsehoods in a legal document, to swear under oath to things he knew weren't true, all to get his hands on money he thought he deserved. I remembered the pamphlet from Dr. Dameron's office, the one about elder financial abuse. It had described exactly this: family members who petition for guardianship, not because their parent needs help, but because they want control. I was living the exact scenario the pamphlet had warned about. My phone was on the table. I picked it up and called Ms. Roberts. She answered on the second ring. "Joan, are you okay?" "They did it," I said. My voice sounded strange, too calm. "They filed for guardianship. I just got served. I need you to bring me those papers immediately," she said. "Can you drive over right now?" "Yes, good. Don't talk to Brian. Don't respond to any calls or messages. Bring me everything you were just served with." 20 minutes later, I was sitting in her office while she read through the petition. Her expression got tighter with each page. "This is garbage," she said finally. "Every single allegation is either a distortion or an outright lie. Can they get away with this? Not if we do our job." She set the papers down and pulled out a legal pad. "Here's what happens next. They've filed this petition. The court will set a hearing date. Between now and then, we build our case." She started making a list, her pen moving quickly. "We have your medical evaluation showing you're completely competent. We need letters from everyone who interacts with you regularly. Your doctor, your property manager, your neighbors, your pastor, anyone who can testify that you're managing your life just fine." "Loretta next door has already offered," I said. "Good. We also need documentation of your financial management. Bank statements showing regular, appropriate transactions, records of your rental properties showing you're making sound decisions, anything that proves you're handling complex tasks without issue." Over the next week, I gathered evidence like I was preparing for war, because that's what it was. A war for my right to exist as a full person. Problem to be managed. My property manager, a no-nonsense man named Robert, wrote a detailed letter about how I'd never missed a decision regarding the rentals, how I reviewed every maintenance request, approved repairs thoughtfully, and kept immaculate records. Dr. Dameron wrote about my excellent health and sharp mind. Dr. Butler sent her neurological evaluation. My pastor wrote about my active involvement in church committees and my clear thinking during meetings. Loretta wrote 3 pages about the years we'd been neighbors, about how I still shoveled her walk when it snowed, brought her soup when she was sick, and managed my household without any confusion whatsoever. "They're trying to paint you as helpless," she'd said when she handed me the letter. "That's the biggest load of nonsense I've ever heard." Ms. Roberts collected everything in a thick binder: medical records, financial statements, character references, proof of competence from every angle. "This is good," she said during one of our prep sessions. "This is really good. But Joan, I need you to be ready for what happens in court." "I'm ready." "You're gonna have to face Brian. You're going to hear him repeat these lies in front of a judge. It's gonna hurt." "I know. And you can't react emotionally. You need to stay calm, answer questions clearly, and let the evidence speak for itself." We practiced. She'd ask me questions the way the opposing lawyer might. "Why did you stop taking Brian's calls? Why did you update your trust? Why did you cut your son out of your estate?" I practiced answering in simple, direct language. Because he was pressuring me. Because I needed to protect myself. Because I overheard him planning to take everything I owned. The truth. Plain and simple. The hearing was set for 3 weeks of May, July 28th, a Tuesday. Ms. Roberts marked it on her calendar. "This is it," she said. "This is where we show the court exactly who you are and exactly what they're trying to do." I stopped answering Brian's calls completely. He left voicemails, his tone shifting between concerned and angry. "Mom, please call me back. We can work this out. You don't need a lawyer. We're family." Then, a few days later, "I can't believe you're doing this. After everything we've done for you. This is how you repay us?" I deleted each message without listening to the whole thing. Ms. Roberts was right. If he wanted to talk, he could talk to her. The night before the hearing, I laid out my clothes. A navy blue suit I'd worn to business meetings years ago. Simple jewelry, sensible shoes. I wanted to look exactly like what I was, a competent woman who knew her own mind. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, practicing what I'd say if the judge asked me directly why I'd structured my estate the way I had. Your Honor, I worked for 50 years to build what I have. I have the right to protect it and to decide who benefits from it. That's not punishment. That's consequence for trying to exploit me. My reflections stared back at me. 72 years old. Gray hair, lines around my eyes. But sharp eyes, clear eyes. Eyes that belonged to someone who knew exactly what she was doing. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. This was a legal battle about whether I was allowed to own my own life. And I was going to win it. The thing about facing a battle is you find out who's really in your corner. 2 days after I was served with the guardianship petition, Loretta showed up at my door with 2 cups of coffee and a determined look on her face. I heard, she said, walking past me into the kitchen like she owned the place. And before you tell me it's fine or you don't want to talk about it, I'm going to stop you right there. We're talking about it. She set the coffee cups down and pulled out a chair. My sister went through this exact thing 5 years ago, Loretta said. Her daughter tried to get guardianship because she wanted to sell my sister's condo and put her in a home. You know why? The daughter's husband had gambling debts. What happened? I asked. My sister fought it, got a lawyer, won. And her daughter hasn't spoken to her since. Loretta took a sip of her coffee. You know what my sister says about that? She says it's the best money she ever spent. Because at least now she's living in her own home on her own terms instead of in some facility. Watching her daughter burn through her life savings, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Don't you dare feel guilty for protecting yourself, Joan Miller. What Brian's doing is wrong. You know it, I know it, and a judge is going to know it too. That conversation with Loretta opened something up. For weeks I'd been carrying this shame, like I was doing something terrible by refusing to hand over everything I owned. Like protecting myself made me a bad mother. But Loretta's words shifted that. This wasn't about being a bad mother. This was about refusing to be a victim. Over the next week, people showed up in ways I didn't expect. Robert, my property manager, stopped by with a folder full of maintenance requests and approvals I'd signed over the past 2 years. Every single one of these shows sound judgment, he said, spreading them out on my kitchen table. You never approve something without asking questions. You get multiple quotes. You make smart financial decisions. If anyone says you can't manage property, they're either lying or they don't know you. My pastor, Reverend Williams, came by on a Saturday afternoon. We sat on my front porch with iced tea, watching cars go by. I've been thinking about what you're going through, he said carefully. And I want you to know something. Setting boundaries with family members who are trying to harm you isn't unkind. It's not unchristian, it's wisdom. He turned to look at me. The Bible talks about honoring your parents, but it also talks about protecting the vulnerable from exploitation. Right now, you're protecting yourself. That's not only okay, it's necessary. I felt tears prick my eyes. It feels like I'm choosing strangers over my own son. You're not choosing strangers. You're choosing yourself. There's a difference. Even my mail carrier, a young woman named Deshawn, who'd been on my route for 3 years, wrote a letter from Ms. Roberts. Mrs. Miller always knows when I'm running late or when there's a package coming, she wrote. She keeps track of her mail, manages her bills, and even baked me cookies last Christmas. She's sharper than most people half her age. Reading these letters, seeing these people rally around me, I felt something start to shift inside. For months I've been reacting, defending, protecting. Always on the back foot, always responding to what Brian was doing. But these letters reminded me of something I'd forgotten. I wasn't just defending myself. I was standing up for the life Hank and I built. For the woman I'd been for 72 years. I decided to do something I hadn't done in months. I went to the salon, not the cheap place I usually went to for a quick trim, the nicer one in the shopping center, the one where they washed your hair in warm water and took their time. Just a haircut, the stylist asked. And maybe some color, I said. Cover the gray, make me look put together. She smiled. You got it. 2 hours later, I walked out with hair that was styled and colored to a soft brown with just a hint of silver. I looked 10 years younger. More importantly, I looked like someone who had her life together. That afternoon, I did something else I'd been avoiding. I went out to the garage and uncovered Hank's car. The 1967 Impala sat there under its tarp, cherry red and gleaming even in the dim garage light. Hank had spent years restoring it, working on weekends, getting every detail right. He'd planned to drive it in retirement, take road trips, feel the wind in his hair. He never got the chance. I opened the door and slid into the driver's seat. It still smelled like him, motor oil and Old Spice and something else that was just Hank. I put the key in the ignition and turned it. The engine roared to life, smooth and powerful. For the next hour, I drove through my neighborhood, down streets Hank and I used to walk, past the old shop that was now under new ownership. I drove with the windows down and the radio off, just feeling the car respond to my hands on the wheel. Brian had suggested more than once that I should sell this car. It's just sitting there, he'd said. It's worth money. But it wasn't just sitting there. It was a promise. A reminder that I still had roads left to drive, places to go, a life to live. When I got home, I parked it carefully back in the garage. But I didn't cover it up this time. I left it ready, waiting. That night, my phone rang. Brian. I let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, I listened to the message. His voice was tight, angry. Mom, I can't believe you're doing this. Getting lawyers involved, turning everyone against us. We're your family. We're trying to help you, and you're choosing strangers over your own son. People who don't even care about you. They just want your money. There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked. After everything we've done for you, after everything Dad would have wanted, this is how you repay us? By treating us like criminals? The message ended. I stood there holding the phone, feeling that old pull. The mother's instinct to fix things, to smooth things over, to make everything okay. Then I deleted the message. Brian wasn't a child who needed protecting. He was a grown man who'd made choices, and those choices had consequences. I was done apologizing for protecting myself. The weekend before the hearing, Ms. Roberts called me into her office for final prep. She set up a mock courtroom scenario, playing the role of the opposing lawyer. Mrs. Miller, isn't it true that you stopped communicating with your son after your husband died? I stopped communicating after I overheard him planning to liquidate my assets. But you were grieving. Couldn't you have been confused about what you heard? I wasn't confused. I heard exactly what they said. We went through it again and again. Every possible question, every angle they might use to make me look incompetent or vindictive. Stay calm, Miss Roberts coached. Don't get emotional. Just state the facts. You're not on trial here. They are. The night before the hearing, I laid out my navy suit, pressed it carefully, polished my shoes, set out simple jewelry. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror and looked at myself. Really looked. I saw a woman who'd built a life from nothing, who'd balanced books and raised a child and managed properties and survived loss. A woman who knew her own mind and wasn't ashamed of it. Tomorrow, I'd walk into that courtroom and show a judge exactly who I was. Not a confused old woman who needed managing, not a problem to be solved. Just Joan Miller, 72 years old, sharp, capable, and done being pushed around. The courtroom in downtown Tampa was exactly as I remembered from that opening scene. Quiet except for the sound of the bailiff's shoes on tile. Cold despite the July heat outside. The kind of place where every whisper felt like a shout. I sat at the respondent's table with Miss Roberts, my hands folded in my lap, trying to keep my breathing steady. Across the aisle, Brian and Kelsey sat with their lawyer, a man in an expensive suit who looked like he did sort of thing every day. Judge Reynolds entered, and everyone stood. He was an older man, probably close to my age, with silver hair and reading glasses perched on his nose. He settled into his chair and gestured for everyone to sit. In the matter of Miller versus Miller, he said, glancing at the docket. Petition for guardianship. Mr. Dalton, you may proceed. Brian's lawyer stood, buttoning his jacket. His voice was smooth. Practiced. Your Honor, this is a difficult case for my clients. Brian and Kelsey Miller. Love Brian's mother very much. They're here today not out of any desire for control or financial gain, but out of genuine concern for an elderly woman who is struggling to manage on her own. I felt Miss Roberts stiffen slightly beside me, but her face remained neutral. Mrs. Joan Miller is 72 years old, the lawyer continued. She recently lost her husband of nearly 50 years. She's isolated, grieving, and making decisions that don't reflect sound judgment. My clients have tried repeatedly to help her, to offer support, but she's refused all assistance and has instead surrounded herself with advisors who may not have her best interests at heart. He painted a picture of a confused widow being manipulated by strangers, a woman who needed her loving family to step in before she hurt herself. It was a good performance. If I didn't know the truth, I might have believed it myself. When he sat down, Ms. Roberts stood. She didn't hurry, she didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at the judge and spoke clearly. Your Honor, the evidence will show that Mrs. Miller is one of the most competent people in this courtroom. She has managed complex financial matters for over 50 years. She has never missed a payment, never failed to maintain her properties, never shown any sign of cognitive decline. What she has done is refuse to hand over control of her life and assets to family members who are deeply in debt and have a clear financial motive. Brian shifted in his seat. Kelsey's jaw tightened. We will demonstrate, Ms. Roberts continued, that this petition is not about protecting Mrs. Miller. It's about accessing her money to solve the petitioner's financial problems. And we will show that Mrs. Miller has taken entirely appropriate steps to protect herself from exactly this kind of exploitation. She sat down. The judge nodded and turned to the bailiff. Let's get the respondent's inventory into the record. This was the moment I'd been both dreading and waiting for. The moment Brian would realize exactly what he was trying to take. The bailiff opened the thick folder Ms. Roberts had prepared. His voice was steady, professional. Item 1. Primary residence, single-family home at 118 Maple Ridge, owned free and clear. Estimated market value, $385,000. I watched Brian's shoulders twitch. In all his planning, he'd never actually asked me if there was still a mortgage. He'd just assumed. Item 2. Personal savings and certificates of deposit held at Gulf Coast Credit Union. Combined balance, $423,000. Kelsey's hand tightened on Brian's arm. Their lawyer leaned forward slightly, his confident expression wavering just a bit. The bailiff turned the page. I held my breath. Item 3. The Miller Family Trust, holding title to 9 rental houses and 1 small commercial building on Fowler Avenue. Appraised total value, $3,170,000. The room went completely silent. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Beneficiaries listed as, the bailiff continued, 3 minor grandchildren, the Tampa Community Scholarship Fund, and 2 longtime employees of Miller Auto. He paused, and I saw Judge Reynolds lean forward. Petitioners Brian and Kelsey Miller are expressly removed as heirs in any circumstance involving alleged elder financial abuse or contested guardianship. The judge's head snapped up. His eyes moved from the document to Brian's table. Brian shot to his feet so fast, his chair slammed into the wooden rail behind him. Removed as heirs? His voice cracked with fury and disbelief. You put strangers over your own son? How could you hide this from us? Mr. Miller, Judge Reynolds warned, his tone sharp. But Brian wasn't listening. His face had gone dark red, his hands clenched into fists. You're sitting on $3 million and you let us struggle. We watched us drown while you hoarded money like some dragon sitting on gold, and now you're doing this to punish us after everything we've done for you. Mr. Miller, sit down, the judge said firmly. After Dad died working himself into the ground to give you everything you wanted, Brian continued, his voice rising. After we took care of you, visited you, tried to help you manage before you lost it all to scammers, this is how you repay us? Stop immediately, Judge Reynolds barked, his voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. He turned to the bailiff without taking his eyes off Brian. Get security in here now. 2 officers stepped through the side door. They moved between the tables, their presence filling the room with sudden weight. Brian finally seemed to realize what he'd done. He sank back into his chair, chest heaving, his lawyer gripping his arm and whispering urgently. Kelsey looked like she might be sick. All the color had drained from her face. A judge shuffled papers, the sound loud in the tense silence. When he spoke again, his voice was cold. "We will proceed, and Mr. Miller, if you cannot control yourself, I will have you removed from these proceedings. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Brian muttered. Judge Reynolds turned to Ms. Roberts. "Counselor, explain this trust." Ms. Roberts stood, calm as ever. "Your Honor, Mrs. Miller and her late husband built their assets over decades through hard work and careful financial management. They created the Miller Family Trust years ago. After Mr. Miller's death, Mrs. Miller updated the trust to add protections against exactly this kind of petition. She gestured toward the stack of documents. Every asset in that list is documented. Every appraisal is independent and recent. The petitioners claimed to be concerned about their mother's well-being, but they had no idea what she actually owned until this moment. That tells us everything we need to know about their level of involvement in her life. "Objection," Brian's lawyer said, standing quickly. "Speculation as to my client's motives." "Overruled," the judge said. "I can draw my own conclusions, and I'm starting to form some." Ms. Roberts didn't smile, but I saw her shoulders relax slightly. The judge turned to me. "Mrs. Miller, I've read your doctor's reports. I've reviewed your financial records. I've seen the letters from your community. But I want to hear from you directly. Why did you structure your affairs this way?" My mouth felt dry. This was it, the moment I'd practiced for. I stood, feeling Ms. Roberts' steadying presence beside me. "Your Honor, my husband and I grew up poor. He worked on cars. I did the books. We didn't have much, but what we had, we took care of. Over 50 years, we bought those rental properties one at a time, so we'd never be a burden in our old age. We set up the trust to make sure everything would be clear and protected." My voice was steady, stronger than I'd expected. "I helped my son many times over the years, paid for his college, bailed him out of debt twice, gave him money for his wedding and his house. I did it gladly because I loved him." I took a breath. "But after my husband died, the only conversations I had with my son were about my money. Where I'd live, who would control what. When I accidentally overheard him and his wife talking about getting everything in my name so they could liquidate it and pay their debts, I realized they didn't see me as a person anymore, just a problem to manage and a source of money." I looked directly at the judge. "So I went to a lawyer. I got medical evaluations. I made decisions to protect myself and to make sure my grandchildren could go to college someday. To thank the men who worked for my husband for 30 years. To help kids in this city who need it. That's what that trust is for. Not to punish my son, but to protect myself and honor what my husband and I built." "Thank you, Mrs. Miller," the judge said. "You can sit." Miss Roberts called Dr. Butler, who testified about my excellent cognitive function. "Robert, my property manager, explained how I'd managed 9 properties without a single misstep. Dr. Dameron confirmed I had no medical issues that would impair my judgment." Brian's lawyer tried to poke holes in it, but there weren't any holes to find. Finally, Judge Reynolds leaned back in his chair. The room went silent. "Here's what I see," he said. "Mrs. Miller is competent, organized, and has a demonstrated history of sound financial management. She's surrounded herself with professionals. She's documented her decisions. Her doctors see no cognitive decline whatsoever." He turned his attention to Brian and Kelsey. "The petitioners, on the other hand, have offered no medical evidence. They appear to be significantly overextended financially. They didn't know the extent of Mrs. Miller's assets, yet they're asking this court to hand them control of everything. And when confronted with a trust that doesn't favor them, Mr. Miller's reaction wasn't concern for his mother. It was outrage at being removed as an heir. He leaned forward. "That tells me exactly what this petition is about." Kelsey made a small choking sound. Their lawyer put both hands flat on the table. "The petition for guardianship is denied," Judge Reynolds said clearly. "Dismissed with prejudice. You may not bring this case again on the same grounds." Brian's head jerked up, his eyes wide. "Furthermore, I'm ordering the petitioners to pay Mrs. Miller's legal fees associated with this matter, and I'm referring this case to the appropriate authorities for review as potential elder financial abuse." The gavel came down. Just like that, it was over. I felt Miss Roberts's hand on my arm. My legs felt unsteady, but I was standing. I was still standing, and I was free. Walking out of that courtroom felt surreal. The hallway smelled like floor cleaner and old coffee. People moved past us. Lawyers with briefcases, families waiting for their cases to be called. Normal Tuesday afternoon business in a downtown courthouse. But for me, everything had changed. Ms. Roberts touched my elbow gently. "You did beautifully in there. Is it really over?" "The guardianship part is. The investigation the judge ordered will take some time. But that's not your problem anymore. That's theirs." I looked back toward the courtroom doors. Brian and Kelsey hadn't come out yet. Part of me wondered what they were saying to each other, what their lawyer was telling them about what came next. Most of me didn't care. "Go home," Ms. Roberts said. "Make yourself some tea. Take a breath. Maybe take that Impala out for a drive." I smiled for the first time that day. "You know about the car?" "I know everything about you, Joan. That's my job." She squeezed my arm. "You're going to be fine. Better than fine. You're going to be free." I drove home slowly, taking the long way through neighborhoods Hank and I used to walk. The sky was that particular shade of blue you only get in Florida summers, bright and clear. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment, just looking at my house. My home, still mine, still under my control. Inside, I made tea like Ms. Roberts had suggested. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd read that guardianship petition weeks ago, and I let myself feel everything I'd been holding back. Relief, exhaustion, grief for the relationship with Brian that was probably gone forever, pride that I'd stood up for myself, sadness that it had come to this. All of it washed over me in waves while my tea got cold. That evening, I went out to the garage and uncovered the Impala. The cherry red paint gleamed under the overhead light. I climbed in, started the engine, and just sat there for a moment, listening to it purr. Then I backed out of the garage and drove. I drove past the old shop where Hank had spent so many years, past the church where we'd gotten married, past the first rental house we'd ever bought, still standing solid with a young family living there now. I drove with the windows down and the radio playing oldies, feeling the summer air on my face. This car was supposed to be Hank's retirement dream. He never got to live it. But I could. I was still here, still capable, still had roads to travel. When I got home, the sun was setting. I parked the car in the driveway instead of the garage. Let the neighbors see it. Let Brian drive by and see it if he wanted. This car wasn't going anywhere, neither was I. Over the next few days, I waited to hear from Brian, an apology maybe, an explanation, something. Nothing came. A week after the hearing, Kelsey sent a single text message. "You've destroyed this family. I hope you're happy." I deleted it without responding. The truth was, I hadn't destroyed anything. I'd simply refused to be destroyed. There's a difference. I met with Ms. Roberts one final time to make sure everything was buttoned up tight. "The trust is solid," she said, walking me through the final documents. "Your grandchildren are protected. When they turn 18, they'll each have money for college that their parents can't touch. The scholarship fund will help kids in Tampa for years to come. And Danny and Ray from the shop will get what they deserve for all those years of loyal work." "What about Brian?" I asked. "He's not disinherited completely. If something happened to you tomorrow for natural causes, he'd still inherit the house and your personal savings. But the trust assets, the big money, that's locked down with the protections we built in." I nodded. It felt fair. Harsh maybe, but fair. "What happens with the investigation?" "That's out of our hands now. The authorities will review the petition, look at the circumstances, determine if charges are appropriate. But Joan, that's not your burden to carry. You did what you needed to do. The rest is up to them." I left her office feeling lighter than I had in months. At home, I started doing things I'd been putting off. I joined a book club at the library, started taking morning walks with Loretta, signed up for a watercolor class at the community center. I even planned a small trip, nothing fancy, just a long weekend in Savannah to see the historic homes and eat good food. Hank and I had always talked about going, but never made the time. I was making the time now. My relationship with Brian's children was complicated. They were young. 7, 9, and 11. Old enough to know something had happened, but too young to understand the details. I sent them birthday cards with checks inside. I didn't know if Brian cashed them or threw them away, but I kept sending them. They were innocent in all this, and I wanted them to know their grandmother hadn't forgotten them. Maybe someday, when they were older, they'd ask questions. Maybe they'd want to hear my side of the story. Maybe they wouldn't. I'd made peace with not knowing. What I did know was this. I was 72 years old. I'd spent 50 years building a life with a good man. I'd raised a son who turned into someone I didn't recognize. I'd survived grief and betrayal and a legal battle that tried to strip me of everything, and I was still standing, still sharp, still capable, still living in my own home on my own terms. People sometimes ask me if I regret how things turned out, if I wish I'd just given Brian what he wanted to keep the peace. The answer is no. What he wanted wasn't peace. It was surrender. He wanted me to hand over my autonomy, my home, my security, everything Hank and I worked for, so he could fix problems he'd created. And I couldn't do that. Not for him, not for anyone. My revenge, if you want to call it that, wasn't some dramatic confrontation. It wasn't public humiliation or clever tricks. It was paperwork. It was saying calmly and clearly, no, this is mine. I decide. It was taking back the narrative about my own life. The day that bailiff read my list in court, my son thought he was watching me lose everything. Instead, he watched me take my life back. If this story hit close to home for you, if you've faced pressure from family who think your age makes you vulnerable, I want you to hear this. You are allowed to protect yourself. You are allowed to say no, even to your own children. You are allowed to put your peace, your dignity, and your hard-earned security ahead of anyone else's comfort. Getting old doesn't make you incompetent. It makes you experienced, and that experience is worth protecting. So wherever you are right now, watching this from your kitchen or your living room or your phone while you're waiting somewhere, drop a comment. Tell me your story if you're comfortable sharing it, and if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone who's being pressured or pushed or told they're too old to make their own decisions, share this with them. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like mine, because I'm not the only woman my age who's refused to disappear quietly. We're still here, we're still sharp, and we're still fighting for the right to live our own lives. The day after the hearing, I woke up in my own bed, in my own house, with my own choices ahead of me. And that, more than anything else, felt like victory.